What's up, everyone? Server actions are a way for you to update data using React. By the end of this video, you'll have a strong understanding of what server actions are, when to use them, and how to use them. If you want the code I use in this video, there's a link to the repo in the description. Now, let's dive in. Let's start with what server functions are. You'll have a good grasp on server functions by the end of this segment of the video. Server functions, also known as server actions, are async functions that run on the server. While they run on the server, they can be called from the client through a network request. It's because of this functionality that they must be async. Server actions allow you to define server-side logic like form handlers or database operations directly within your React components. You're then able to invoke that logic from the client without writing a separate API route. When that logic is invoked, Nextjs doesn't send the function to the browser. Instead, Nextjs generates a unique endpoint for it and keeps it on the server. This process keeps sensitive information away from the client side, which allows you to use business-critical and proprietary information without fear of leaking anything to the browser. Under the hood, the browser issues a POST request to the unique endpoint that's automatically generated. The function's arguments are then serialized in the request body. Then, UI and data updates are sent to the client. All of this is done in one round trip without a full page refresh. Serialization is the process of converting an in-memory value to a format that can be transmitted or stored. This usually means converting objects, arrays, or other data structures into a plain text format such as JSON. The browser and server can't directly share memory, so this process translates your code into a common language to then be sent back and forth over the network. You define server actions by adding the special useServer directive to the top of the file. As a reminder, the useServer and useClient directives come from React, not Nextjs. Nextjs simply builds upon this architecture to fit into Nextjs's data fetching paradigm. Mutations and form submissions are handled on the server, lending itself to Nextjs's server-first rendering methodology. For example, if you have a static site that needs occasional fresh data, you can use a server action to revalidate that data. One simply needs to call revalidatePath or revalidateTag at the end of their server action to purge and refresh the cache for that path or tag set. More on that later. Now that you have a strong understanding of what server actions are, let's talk about when to use them. By the end of this section of the video, you'll know when one should use server actions. You'll want to use server actions anywhere you need to handle user input or update data on the server. Using server actions allows you to keep this code simple and close to your React components, as well as validate inputs using libraries like Zod. This functionality is useful for form handling and submissions. You don't need to create an API for a form. All you need to do is attach a server action to the form's action attribute. When the form is submitted, Nextjs invokes the server function with the form data. This method is ideal for contact forms, settings forms, and any other create or update form you have in your app or website. You get to perform any server-side validation, database writes, or email sending securely without exposing any sensitive logic to the browser. If you want to modify data, use a server action. Server actions allow you to execute mutations and other server-side operations securely directly on the server. Think operations like updating a user profile, posting a comment, liking a piece of content, or deleting an item. You can do this without writing client-side fetching logic or exposing database details. The mutation logic lives alongside your UI code, but it runs on the server. This can help reduce boilerplate and simplify your stack since you won't need a separate API route for each mutation. You also avoid managing extra state for the request and response. All of this helps keep your project organized and easy to navigate. While there may be some performance gains, you may see significant productivity gains as well. If you find yourself using useEffect a lot for user interactions, consider using a server action instead. Instead of using fetch to call an API like addItem on a form submission, you can call an addItem server function. As I mentioned earlier, skipping the API routes wherever possible removes a layer of complexity and disorganization from your app. Forms with server actions automatically work with or without JavaScript. That means that server actions are helpful for progressive enhancements and simplifying backend communication. When a network is slow or the JavaScript hasn't loaded, a form submission will gracefully fall back to a traditional full-page post to ensure the action still runs. Once the app progressively becomes more hydrated, though, the submissions happen in the background and the page doesn't have to reload. Server actions are powerful and flexible, but they're not a one-stop shop when it comes to updating data. Using server actions in server components is redundant, unnecessary, and inefficient. In fact, doing this adds an unnecessary round trip because the server calls itself. You can use fetch, direct database queries, or Payload's local API if you're using Payload CMS. If you're communicating with an external API or using third-party data, you should still use fetch or route handlers to take care of this. Server actions are internal to your app, so unless you're trying to rebuild the functionality of server actions, it will be a fruitless effort using them for external APIs. Now that we know what server actions are and when one should and should not use them, let's go over how to use server actions in a project. By the end of this segment of the video, you'll have a strong understanding and a strong grasp on how to use server actions in your projects. To show this off properly, I've created this Payload CMS project, which has a submissions collection that we will use server actions to write into. I'm going to come over to the page.tsx file, which is the home page, and replace all of this with a form that I have already created. We can see what this looks like by running pnpm dev and loading up localhost 3000 and going to the home page. And we can see it's just a simple form that has server actions as the H1 and accepts a title for our form submissions. We can create a server function within the same file by creating an async function above our default export. And we'll call this function submit, and that'll have the form data with the form data type, and we'll open the function. And we'll add the use server directive to the top here. And we'll have a constant called payload, which will await get payload, which we'll need to import, as I can see got imported right here. And we're going to also use our config. Now we need to import the config. So I will import config from payload config. And then we can create another constant called title. And we're going to get that from our form data. So we'll get title, and then we'll make sure that this is cast as a string. And then we can see this logged. So we'll log it as title logged. And we'll need to make sure we do the interpolation right. And then we're going to await payload.create collection submissions. Then we've got our data title. And so here we've got an issue with the collection. So we're going to run payload generate types to fix that. So now if I run pnpm dev again, we see our errors go away. Now you may be asking, where does form data come from? Form data comes from the native web APIs. It's not exclusive to Nextjs. All this does is it allows you to access the native form data from the browser layer. Now we can add this action to our form. So we'll add it to the top here so it's easy to see. And we'll do action, and then we'll include submit. So now when I save this, I can come over here and type in test as the title and hit submit. And I can see test got logged and a post request was sent and everything refreshed and it's good to go. We have submitted a new submission item to our collection submissions. So instead of trying to go into our admin UI, why don't we just render this on the front end? So we will have in our exported default function here, another constant called payload, where we'll await get payload's config again, and we'll get our submissions, and we'll get the docs from our submissions. We're going to await payload.find collection submissions, and we're going to limit this to 0, which is going to get all of them. So now we've got our docs here, and underneath our form, we're going to render our submissions. So we're going to style as we go using inline styles. So I'm going to use the list style attribute here, which will be none. We'll have padding of 0, margin of 0. Then we're going to map through our submissions. So I will get our docs and map through the docs. We'll need the doc as well as an index for our React keys. And we're going to, for every doc, have a list item, and that list item will have a key of index. And really, we can actually use the doc ID here instead, since all payload objects are created with an ID. Then we'll have a style attribute, which I will include as padding with 12 pixels. Again, I'm just using inline styles for ease of styling. Normally you would use Tailwind or SCSS or just a general CSS module, but this is just going to be faster for now. And I have preset some styles, so I'm just going to paste those in, and then we're going to paste the rest of the content here, where I will have inside the list item the doc title and when it was created. So now I can save this, and we can see this test that we created show up. So now if I add another test, so we'll add test 2, we'll hit submit, and we can see that test 2 got logged, but nothing showed up until I refresh. So we want to fix that. In order to fix that, we just need to import revalidatePath from Nextjs. And then we'll add revalidatePath to the end here, where we're going to revalidate the home page. And now if I save this and try test 3 and submit, we can see that it gets added immediately. We could also use a redirect here, so we can import redirect from Next Navigation. Now, one thing to note is when you use a redirect, no code afterwards can be executed. So if I try to console log anything, we'll see that I get this warning line and it says it's unreachable code. So redirect has to be the last line if you want to use that. So this doesn't really make sense, but I can just say redirect to admin, and when I hit submit, it'll redirect me, here we can see in the server logs, to the admin route. And now we see that the admin route pops up, but I don't want that. So I'm going to remove the redirect from the import as well as from the function. And in fact, we need to move the function altogether because this is not best practice. So we'll just copy everything from revalidatePath and up and create, alongside our front end, a new directory called actions, and I'll call this first one submit.ts. So I'll create the file and then paste all that information in here, remove the React import, and then come over here to remove our server function here. And then I'll remove the revalidatePath import as well. I get this error, and that's because submit no longer exists, but it will here in a minute soon. So I'm going to move the useServer directive to the top here. We're going to export this async function, and we can leave everything else the same, but come here and import submit from our actions submit.ts. When I save this, I'll go ahead and restart my server just in case, and then refresh over here, and then try to submit test 4. And I can see that nothing has changed except for my project structure, and I can see all of my list items still showing up here. As I mentioned, you can also use server actions in client components. A use case for this would be to add something like a delete icon to our list here. So let's add that. I'll first go over to our actions directory and create a new file called delete.ts. Add that. We can use server here. We're going to import get payload because I know I'm going to need that to delete, which means I need my config from payload config. And then finally, again, we'll need the revalidatePath from Nextjs. We're going to export an async function called deleteItem, which is going to take the ID of an item, which is a string, and we will initialize payload by awaiting get payload, pass in the config, and then we're going to await payload.delete from the collection of submissions, and we're going to pass in the ID. Then, for good measure, we're going to log that item ID deleted, and we'll add successfully, and then we can revalidate our path of homepage again. Then we're going to create a delete button component. So in our app directory, I can create a new file, which will be called index.tsx. So this is going to create a new directory in the app folder, in the components folder, and the delete button folder, and it's going to be called index.tsx. And I'm going to create that file. And in this file, I am going to use client, and I'm going to import our delete item from our front end actions delete. We'll export a constant called delete button, and that will take an ID, which will have the type of string, and we'll open up a function, and there will be a constant called handle delete, which is going to be set equal to an async anonymous function, and it's going to await our server action delete item, and we need to pass in the ID. Then we can return a button, which I have certain styles set for it. So I'm going to just type in button for now, and then this will be delete. And then we can pass in our styles here. And then we need to add an onClick attribute, which is going to handle our delete. Now we need to add this to our list of items. So I'm going to import our delete button from our components delete button and add it to our list item and put it below our title here. So we'll include delete button and pass in the doc ID, and I can hit save and we'll see the delete button show up right there. I'm going to change the styles a little bit to include a div to surround the strong and the delete button with a few styles to make it look a little bit neater and easier to see. So there we can see the delete show up on the right side and then the title on the left. Now when I hit delete, I'll delete this redirect to admin one. When I delete it, it just goes away and I can see that item of this ID was deleted successfully. So what if you wanted to show a loading state for those on slow networks? You can do that using React's useActionState hook. So let's go change our button. We'll go over to our index.tsx and we're going to import two things, start transition from React, as well as useActionState. So now at the top of the file, we can include our useActionState, and this is going to provide three things. The first is state, which can be used to send messages from the server action to the client for things such as sending a toast message. Of course, this is a delete action, so we're not going to be able to see anything because the page will revalidate and the message will be gone. The other one is the action, which is the actual server action we're going to be using, and pending, which is the pending state. So here we're going to include our delete item, and we're going to use something called bind. Now we're going to bind null as the initial argument and then pass in the ID. What bind does in this circumstance is it binds or attaches the ID we provide to our delete item function. Because useActionState expects a function with no arguments, this essentially creates a new function with no arguments and preloads the ID into the function. Now React can call this function without needing arguments, but still apply it to our item with this ID. We can comment out our handle delete function, and then we can come down to our onClick and create an async function here and start transition action. And then we can set the disabled state by adding pending here. So now we can change this to be pending. And if pending is true, we can set this to be deleting or a spinning circle or whatever you want on the front end, or delete. And now with my Chrome window open, I can inspect and go to network and slow down the network speed here for a minute. And then if I click delete, we can see that deleting shows up and then it deletes. And so now here I get an error saying that this expected 2 to 3 arguments, but got 1. If I go over to my delete, I can return a message here. So we can do successfully deleted item. And what this will do is it'll send a message from the server to the client, and we can set our default to be not submitted. And that error goes away, and we now know how to also pass messages between client and server. Now, again, this is deleting an item, so we won't see any messages returned unless I moved some stuff around. Now you know how to use server actions across your apps and websites. These add a powerful layer of interactivity while keeping sensitive information private on the server. Use server actions to communicate with sensitive APIs or databases without losing interactivity or fumbling around with workarounds. If you found this video helpful, please like it and share it with others who might also find it useful. Be sure to subscribe to my channel so you never miss when I release more content about Next.js, Payload CMS, or more. Also consider becoming a member of my channel. Members receive exclusive perks like early access to some videos and more. There's a link on how to sign up to be a member of my channel in the description. If you have questions or suggestions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Until then, I'll see you on the next one.